Welcome to a new episode of our podcast dedicated to regulatory affairs and life science. In today's episode, we will address a topic that is raising quite a few doubts among startups and software houses in the health tech world. Is our software a medical device? With healthcare digitalization fully ongoing, many applications created for clinical or telemedicine goals are now at risk of falling into the cases regulated by Regulation EU 2017/745, the so-called MDR. But how is it possible to understand whether one's product really needs the CE marking and the associated documentation? In this episode, we will try to answer the 20 most frequent questions that we received from companies, startups and developers, a practical path to regulatory compliance based on the European regulations, the MDCG guidelines, and our daily consulting experience. You ready? Let's start then. Is my software a medical device according to the MDR? Let's start with the most direct question. Is my software a medical device? The answer is, it depends. A software becomes a medical device when it has an explicit intended medical purpose. If, that is, it was intended to diagnose, prevent, monitor, treat or relieve a disease. It is not the technology that counts, but rather the reason why it was designed and whom it is intended for. What requirements should a software have to be classified as a medical device? This is where the real play is. Not all health software are medical devices. The key element is again the intended use declared by the manufacturer. So, specific medical purpose, diagnosis, treatment, clinical monitoring, intended to be used in humans. It can work autonomously or as a part of a wider medical system. It should generate direct effects on health or support clinical decisions. If one of these points is missing, it probably doesn't fall into the MDR. If they are present, however, regulatory obligation begins. Is a health monitoring hub a medical device? It depends on the kind of monitoring. If it is limited to steps counting or sleep control for general wellness, no, it is just a wellness app. If, on the other side, it monitors heart rate to identify potential arrhythmias, then yes, it might be a medical device. What is the difference between medical software and wellness software? It is a subtle but crucial distinction. A wellness software only aims at improving one's lifestyle. Just think of those counting calories, tracking steps, or suggesting breathing exercises. A medical software, on the other hand, has a diagnostic or therapeutic purpose. This separating line is essential to establish whether your design falls into the field of application of the MDR. What is meant by medical purposes of a software? When we talk of medical purposes, we mean the reason why that software was created. It is not important whether it uses a complex algorithm or a simple database. The important thing is what you declare in your purpose document. If it is used to diagnose a condition, it is a medical purpose. If it is used to monitor the trend of a disease, it is a medical purpose. If it supports a therapeutic process, such as dose calculation, it is a medical purpose. If it prevents pathological conditions, it is still a medical purpose. Carefully defining this element is the first step to understand if the MDR requirements have to be followed. When is a software considered as an accessory and not as a medical device? This is an interesting point. A software can be catalogued as accessory when it does not perform an autonomous medical function directly, but it helps a main medical device to work properly. Here are some practical examples. A tool calibrating the parameters of a mechanical ventilator. It is an accessory because it does not process clinical data. An app sending orders to a pump for infusion without processing any clinical value. Still an accessory. A program transmitting collected data with no processing to a central system. It's an accessory, not an MD. If, on the other hand, that algorithm processes data to support diagnosing or clinical monitoring, then it becomes a medical device itself. Accessories fall into the field of application of the MDR under Article 1.1 and Article 2.2, but they follow a smoother regulatory pathway compared to main devices. Here's my software, SaMD, software as a medical device. Yes, if your software is autonomous and performs a clinical function with no need of a dedicated medical hardware. If a computer or smartphone are sufficient to make it run and has a clinical impact. For instance, supporting decisions, it falls into the definition of an SaMD. Should a software processing clinical data be CE marked? This also depends on the scope. If the processing has a clinical purpose, for instance, it points out out-of-range values, supports diagnosis, sends alerts, then yes, the CE marking is required. If, on the other hand, it collects or displays data with no direct scopes of diagnosis or alert, it might not be required. How can I classify the risk of my software according to the MDR? The risk classification is based on 4 elements: severity of the impact on Earth, mild damage versus serious irreversible damage, intended use, hospital, domestic, emergency use context, Earth operators versus patient using it autonomously, possible consequences in case of malfunctioning. The outcome ranges from Class 1 low risk up to Class 3 high risk. The more critical is the function for Earth, the higher is the class. What are the documental obligations for MD software? An MD software requires a set of mandatory documents with different level of details based on the risk class. The main includes technical dossier, the core of conformity, where you describe the architecture, scope, requirements, tests, and the whole technical and clinical validation, risk analysis, risk management, according to ISO 14971, to map risks, severity, probabilities, and define mitigation measures. Clinical evidence, clinical evaluation. It is needed to demonstrate with studies or literature that your software works as expected. It may include real-world data. Labeling and instructions for use, the IFU, mandatory and in compliance with Annex 1 of the MDR, they should be clear, complete and advised. Post-marketing surveillance, PMS, a proactive system to collect feedback, report adverse events, monitor field use and update the software in real time. Post-market clinical follow-up, PMCF, plan and report. Especially Class 2 and above, it is used to monitor the clinical efficacy of the software in time. The complexity of these documents increases based on the class of your device, but it is not possible to overlook any of these elements if the product is an actual medical device. Does my software need a notified body for its certification? If your software is Class 2A, 2B or 3, then yes, you have to refer to a notified body to obtain the CE certification. If, on the other hand, it falls into Class 1, you can self-certify it, but beware, you need to demonstrate that you complied with all technical, clinical and quality requirements all the same. Which are the European regulations applying to medical software? On the European front, the main norms are the following: MDR 2017-745. It defines the safety and performance requirements for all medical devices, including software. GDPR for the protection of health personal data. Cybersecurity directives, for instance NIS2, that are essential if your software manages sensitive data or is connected to clinical networks. Then there are voluntary technical norms, such as the ISO 13485, the Quality System for Medical Devices, and IEC 62304, the standard for the life cycle of a medical software, development, maintenance, and discontinuation. Is there any guideline to establish if a software is a medical device? Yes. The MDCG, Medical Device Coordination Group, 2019-11, is the most complete official guideline to understand how to interpret the regulations and determine whether your software is an MD. It contains flowcharts and clear criteria to understand classification. The guidelines MDCG 2023-4 and MDCG 2019-16 Revision 1 are also available. What does the MDCG 2019-11 guidance say about software? The MDCG 2019-11 guidance explains step by step if the software has the purpose of diagnosing, monitoring, or treating, if it works autonomously or is part of a device, how to attribute the risk class based on use scenarios. In practice, it will guide you in tracing the decision map that will tell you if you are in or out of the MDR framework. How is the software classification changed with the switch from the MDD to the MDR? This was a big leap. Under Directive 9342 CEE, the MDD, much software was classified in Class 1 because there were no specific rule. Under the MDR, Rule 11 in Annex 8 was introduced, dedicated just to software. Before, with the MDD, there were grade zones and much interpretation. After, with the MDR, Class 2A, 2B or 3 depends on the clinical function and on the risk. Class 2A, information supporting diagnostic or therapeutic decisions. Class 2B, if such decisions may imply a serious risk. Irreversible damage, invasive surgery. Class 3, if use may cause lethal or invalidating consequences. Class 1, only software with no medical scope or for administrative managing support. This means that before, many solutions could slip into Class 1. Now they require the evaluation by a notified body and much more rigorous documentation. Should a software used by physicians be always certified as a medical device? Absolutely no. If the software is a mere managing or administrative tool, a digital diary, data filing with no clinical analysis, certification is not needed. Only when it helps diagnosis or decisions on therapies, the MDR obligation applies. Is a software supporting clinical decision a medical device? Yes. The so-called CDSS, Clinical Decision Support Systems, clearly fall into the category of medical devices if they directly affect the diagnostic or therapeutic pathway. Also in this case, the logics of Rule 11 apply. If the decision affecting patient's health may depend on the output, then you are in the framework of the MDR. Is an AI algorithm a medical device? If the output of the algorithm has a clinical impact, for instance, it establishes diagnosis or it suggests a treatment, then yes, it is a medical device. AI is not exempted from rules. On the contrary, it requires special attention on clinical validation, risk management, and post-market surveillance. Can I sell my software without CE marking? Only if it is not a medical device. If you have verified that your app or algorithm is outside the MDR legal framework, for instance, a physical exercise app, you can market it with no CE marking. Otherwise, the CE marking is mandatory to be able to sell in the European Union. What is the difference between a standalone software and a software embedded in a medical device? Standalone or freestanding software works independently, typically as an app in a smartphone or as a program installed on a PC. An embedded software is an integral part of a physical medical device, such as an infusion pump firmware. They are both regulated by the MDR, but a classification may depend on the architecture and on the use context. A standalone software suggesting a diagnosis falls into Rule 11, the forest complex firmware inside the medical machinery. How can we help? Determining whether a software is a medical device is not only a question of regulations but also strategic operation and a legal responsibility. A classification error may result in slowing down or blocking in the marketing, possible sanctions or product recalls, more retrofit costs if you discover too late that your software needs a notified body. At DRENS or Regulatory Affairs, we have supported many startups, software houses and developers. Evaluating the correct classification of the software, preparing the technical dossier, risk analysis and required clinical studies, interacting with notified bodies, speeding up the evaluation time, designing, implementing and monitoring an SGQ, advices on GDPR and cybersecurity, because a digital health ecosystem should be safe from any point of view. If you have specific question or you wish a custom-made advice, send us an email or visit our website. We are here to simplify what at first sight may appear very complex. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Join us on next episode where we will discuss other topics from the regulatory world. If you wish to keep up with our regulatory news, sign up for our channel, click on the bell icon and follow us on all social media.